Hi folks, I'm making a lot more videos these days, aren't I? Comment came through from Lyrical Orion, who said, at the end when you say consciousness is another dimension of existence, is this a new realization? It is quite profound. And I've been trying to comprehend this idea since you said it. Yeah, I maybe just sort of tacked that on as an afterthought. That does bear some explaining. I've been thinking about this recently. It's not really a new insight or anything, but it is something that I've been trying to get greater clarity on. So let's talk about consciousness as a dimension. Now I know in string theory they have something like, what, 20-something dimensions? So if I said that consciousness is like the fifth dimension, time being the fourth, and then we have the three dimensions of space, length, breadth, and height. I don't know, maybe a string theorist would just balk at that, but he's thinking at a level that is beyond me, so I gotta keep this at my level here. But what I do know is that the general consensus on consciousness from what I imagine is the overwhelming majority of scientists on the matter, it just doesn't cut the ice. Especially if you're in a position like me where you've had a legitimate parapsychological experience. Oh, that's a big claim, isn't it? Long-term subscribers will know what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the experiments with psychokinesis. So the general view in science is that reality is materialistic in nature. It consists of material. So you have the three dimensions of space and the one dimension of time, and that accounts for space-time. That is reality. And everything about it fits into that. So consciousness is viewed as a product of something that is going on within space-time. And I know it looks just like that if you just take a general observation about that matter. You know, planets formed as a result of the Big Bang. Well, a lot of more things happened before that happened, but we ended up with planets. And on planets, at least on ours, this weird thing called life formed. So the planets produced the life and the life produced the consciousness, and it really looks like a causal relationship between matter first, consciousness second. But there's a couple of reasons why that's not good enough. One is we haven't been able to understand consciousness in the same way that we've been able to understand other aspects of reality. We've been able to look right into the atom and uncover protons, neutrons, electrons, and then there's quarks and all sorts of other things, and we've understood how electrons behave, even to an extent anyway, even when they aren't even bound by the laws of space-time, or the laws of, you know, not space-time, the laws of relativity. We have electrons existing, you know, we have electrons changing position by exploring every point in the universe. I don't claim to understand that, but that is what I read when I read the sort of literature on quantum physics that's designed for the lay reader, such as myself. You know, that's what it says. So look at how much we've been able to understand. So we, you know, to do with matter. Then move over to consciousness, and we're looking at the brain. And we understand all sorts of things about how the brain functions, but we can't find an actual observer inside it. And this is not just me saying it. I mean, I've read Sam Harris. His book, Waking Up, is really interesting, and he's neurobiology. That's his field. So he would know about the brain a lot more than I would, and he is ready to say we can't find an actual self in there. We can see what the brain is doing, but we don't know why it evokes this whole internal landscape that we call our conscious existence, this whole subjective experience thing, the feeling that there is an I, and it can't be found in the brain. So this has been called the hard problem. the hard problem of consciousness. And you can keep saying, well, we haven't found it yet, but one day we will. But not even Sam Harris, I don't think, takes that view. You know, it's just not there. The work has been done, and there isn't a component of the brain called consciousness. So we are left with either ignoring it or trying to model consciousness in a different fashion. So that's what I've been trying to do. And that's what I'm doing by referring to consciousness as a dimension. Now, why would I go so far as to actually say that consciousness is more than just a localized sort of ephemeral thing, even sitting inside someone's head? Well, again, it's because of parapsychology. And I know this is a hard sell because parapsychology has been plagued with fraudsters, with people who pretend to have psychic powers for personal glamour. And people have called me that, even though all I've really demonstrated is a couple of very down-to-earth experiments that have measurable but very small results. You know, if I was looking for glamour, I'm going about it all wrong. So if I can sit there, this is where it gets really mind-blowing, right? If I can sit there and will something to move, something very small, like the psi wheel that I've been using, in conditions where it's very hard for it to move, with the glass bowl, not using my hand, just trying to use a mind state, a state of consciousness to cause an object to move. And somehow the energy that is available in my body seems to be marshaled at my command to do my bidding and to cause movement. Now, that's very hard to do that. It hardly ever works. But when it does, it is absolutely mind-blowing, because it suggests that consciousness extends outside of the brain in a way that neurobiology has no real way to account for. So we can't think about it in the same terms. And if you're lucky enough to have had some kind of experience of extrasensory perception, and the real ones seem to be more like accidents than actual skills, what I'm talking about is just, you know, you somehow get the feeling about something and it turns out to be true. That kind of a thing. And I know you could maybe think, well, it's just luck. But what if it's a really extreme one? And I've used this example before, but it's a good one, where an inexplicable feeling of dread comes over you. And then shortly afterwards, you get a phone call that tells you one of your loved ones has been in a car accident. That is, things of that nature are not explainable with a model of consciousness that locates it inside the brain as a kind of component of the brain that is absolutely separate from the physical environment between two people. Psychokinesis is not explainable that way. Any form of extrasensory perception is not explainable that way. Now, bear in mind, folks, millions of US dollars were thrown at this sort of research at one point in time. You know, this is not a laughing matter. So if you're on the other side of that divide, if you've come to terms with the fact that at least some forms of psi phenomena are real, and I'm on that side of the divide, then you have to realize, you have to come to terms with the fact that most scientists in the world, although in general terms they are more intelligent than I am, they are actually ignoring a whole side of reality that has a direct bearing on explaining reality. Stephen Hawking, for instance, brilliant as he is not interested in consciousness. But if consciousness is more than just a thing sitting in here, then what he's actually doing in pursuing a theory of everything in purely materialistic terms, it's not going to get him where he wants to go. And I'm really hoping that people like Dean Radin, for instance, who I think is a brilliant writer, are eventually going to get taken more seriously on a global level, and parapsychology will eventually mature into a respected and recognized scientific discipline. We're not there yet, and we've got a ways to go. But speaking personally, having had sufficient experience to convince myself that there is something legitimately interesting going on that is not being accounted for in the general widespread scientific paradigm, I'm ready to model consciousness in a different way. So I think of it as a dimension of existence. So 1, 2, and 3, there's your dimensions of space. 4, there's time. 5, there's consciousness. Now, why model it in that fashion? Well, if you can think of consciousness as a kind of field that permeates all of space-time, and that field is fuzzy in the sense that it's not focused, it's not doing anything, but it comes into focus through apparatus such as the brain. So if you imagine a big invisible fuzzy field permeating everything, and at this area it is funneled into your brain. So that's what consciousness is. So we're all connected over space using consciousness, and that's what allows parapsychological phenomena to occur. And the reason why I like this model in particular is because it can correctly account for the hard problem of consciousness, in the sense that we can't find a self within the brain precisely because there is no self in the brain. The self is the field of consciousness that permeates everything. There aren't really any individuals. There's just consciousness as a dimension, having an experience of individuality through multiple focal points all across space and time. You see? Hard problem of consciousness is solved, at least in an abstract way, not proven, but solved in an abstract way by realizing that it's not a problem because it's not in there. Consciousness is elsewhere. It's in everything. So, reality is space, time, and consciousness, or mind, space, time, if you want to think of it like that, instead of just space, time. Now, I like this also because the mystics are always trying to convince people, not always, but the prevailing view among mystics is that consciousness is fundamental and consciousness gives rise to the material universe. Whereas the scientists are always saying, no, 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 the material universe is fundamental and it gives rise to consciousness within itself. So if you think of it as 5 interdependent dimensions of existence, or 3 dimensions if you want to think about space as a single dimension containing 3 subdimensions. See, these are just labels. It's not that there are literally 5 dimensions. We could put any kind of language structure we want on this. It just has to be rationally coherent. So, because consciousness is number 5, that doesn't give it any more preeminence than the other 4. So I could literally say I could make matter primary, and I could say, in a sense, and I could say consciousness is the 5th dimension of space. You see? Or we could swap it all around And I could say the first dimension is consciousness, the second dimension is time, and the third, fourth, and fifth dimensions are space. And I could say the three dimensions of space are, no, sorry, getting myself mixed up. I could say length, breadth, and height are dimensions of consciousness. You see what I mean? You can swap them around and say one of the other. I could say space is a dimension of time. Time is a dimension of space. Consciousness is a dimension of space. Space is a dimension of consciousness. It's a mutual interdependence. It's a relationship of goes with, not a relationship of one caused the other. So it means the materialists are still happy. They can still say we have space, and within space we have time and consciousness. See what I mean? Because you can't have consciousness without an experience of consciousness, and that requires space and time. But I would also assert that you can't have space and time without consciousness as well. Otherwise, there's no one to see the space and time, if you know what I mean. It all goes together. So the problem between materialism and idealism, as it's called, idealism is the view that consciousness is primary. There isn't really a conflict there when you model it in this way. So that's the way I like to model consciousness. And it's not real as an entity, because when you call something consciousness, that's like saying it's an entity. No. Time, for instance, is not an entity. Space is not an entity. These are terms we are using to denote how to measure particular phenomena. So time and space are just measurements. So is consciousness. We measure it in relation to where it's focused, I guess. Again, it's a theoretical model. But I think it's one, this or something like this is going to have to be taken more seriously in future, because I think eventually there's going to be some sort of eureka moment in science where we realize we can't keep ignoring consciousness. You know, the whole idea of there being multiple universes is one way of trying to get around the problem of why are the laws of our universe so finely tuned to allow for our existence? How did our universe begin in a state of low entropy? And by low entropy I mean low disorder, high order, in other words. Entropy is the idea that everything in a closed system tends towards disorder. So where did the order come from in the beginning with the Big Bang, if we're tending towards disorder? That's a big problem in physics. One way around that is to suppose that there were multiple universes at the Big Bang that were all cordoned off from each other, all exploding out in different dimensions. And because you had so many of them, then that gives you an opportunity for one of them to be just right. And this, the one that we are in, is the one that is just right. So it's a theory, but I think a far more elegant and simple theory is just the idea that the universe is aware. There is a dimension of the universe called consciousness or awareness. So things are as they are because this whole thing is alive. It's alive as us. That's how that consciousness manifests. I think the universe is a construct that is always striving to become aware, and it does that through organisms on planets, and it may do it in other ways that we're not aware of, but it certainly does it in this way, because this is us. That's what we are. How does a dead universe produce life? That doesn't make any sense. The universe has to be alive if it produces life. Otherwise we're zombies, technically speaking. You know? These are problems in science. And I'm not a scientist. I'm more of a philosopher. And that's maybe why I see these as problems and some scientists don't. I don't know. And it may seem absurd to me to think that I know something that somebody like Stephen Hawking doesn't. But I'm sorry, I do. And this is true of any of you who have had a psi experience, a parapsychological experience, that you have examined carefully enough that you are confident it's legitimate. So anyway, there we go, folks. Consciousness as a dimension of the universe.